Counter-Narrative News. Really excited to bring this fantastic new series on Claudia Jones, an absolutely prolific, amazing revolutionary leader from Trinidad. Is a black liberation and communist leader in the USA. Then she comes to London, prolific grassroots organizer, organizing against anti-immigration laws, comrades with Paul Robeson, organizing a Caribbean carnival event at St. Pancras Town Hall in the late 50s, hooking up with, as a political comrade and level of romantic involvement with Indian Punjab heritage, Abu Manu or Manu Manchanda, who's also a important figure in radical left politics in London and Britain as well historically. An activist around anti-colonial causes, goes to visit Mao in China, campaigns against the atom bomb at peace conference in Japan, advocates for peace in relation to the growing warpath by Western imperialism against the Soviet Union. It's just such an inspiring, such a leading figure in our struggle, elevates our struggle to a massive level across two continents, the Americas, particularly the Caribbean and the USA, and in London. So just a quick biography. She's born as Claudia Cumberbatch, actually, and she adopts the name Claudia Jones to kind of hide her immigrant background, really, in New York because of anti-immigrant discrimination. She was born on the 21st of February 1915 in Trinidad. At 8 years old, because of growing poverty on the island of Trinidad in the Caribbean, her family travel and migrate to New York City. She faces immigrant discrimination there, but still she forges ahead, is a brilliant student in her class through education. She joins a Harlem drama group and also a Harlem-based journal in which she writes a column called Claudia Comments. So you can see this confidence of intellect and writing by Claudia Jones. In 1936, you can see she's kind of, because she faces immigrant discrimination, anti-black racism, and as a woman as well, of course, all these things put together in terms of the oppression of a racist capitalist colonial society. But she kind of, it's the Communist Party of USA when she really flourishes, and the CPUSA is still quite radical because particularly of Lenin's leadership to the entire communist movements linked to the Communist International, which Lenin leads. Lenin, as we've discussed many times, is one of the most radical global leader pushing communist parties, especially in places like the USA and Britain, like really against itself in many ways, kind of breaking it out of its internalized racism and colonial nationalisms and engaging with the most radical type of politics, particularly Lenin advocating for black liberation around the so-called Black Belt, the majority black working class southern states. So it's a space and a place where black people can really flourish, including Claudia Jones, and what an amazing leader she becomes in so doing. She is a leader of the Young Communist League, attracted to the party because of the party's advocacy and campaigning around young black boys called the Scottsboro Boys, who are wrongly accused of harassing white women, and they're put through a horrific oppressive judicial kind of process in which communists and others are in their defense. A very, very famous case at the time, anti-racist case. She becomes the editor of the kind of the column for black affairs called quote-unquote Negro Affairs for the Communist Party's mass publication Daily Worker. So then she faces a whole bunch of arrests in a period in the late 40s of massive repression against communists and their sympathizers in this kind of massive anti-communist racist drive by the US state post the Second World War. So in 1948 she's arrested for the first time, and in 1950 she spends the first stint in prison from November the 17th to December the 21st, and this compounded with her health problems. She had tuberculosis from the age of 17. Her mum died several years earlier when she was 13. Perhaps she had problems in her housing. Harlem had notorious housing problems in this period between the wars in the 1930s of the Great Depression, of grossly inadequate housing. Perhaps that also contributed to her health problems around tuberculosis, respiratory disease. And also the repression and the prison stints also exacerbates her cardiovascular problems as well. So she spends she's convicted in 1953 in the courts. She has heart failure, hospitalized for 21 days, again in prison in 1955 from January the 11th to October the 23rd. She wants to actually, she's basically forced out of the United States through these oppressive judicial processes. She wants to go back to Trinidad. Colonial governor of Trinidad is like, no way do we need a black radical, black liberation woman and leader coming to Trinidad to kick up trouble against the Brits. She's barred returning back to her island there in the Caribbean. So she arrives to London on a journey. She starts on December the 9th, arrives to England on December the 22nd, and becomes this amazing, prolific grassroots and anti-colonial, anti-imperialist leader here, and also this one of the pioneering journals and media organs of the African and Asian and Caribbean grassroots, the West Indian Gazette with Manchanda, which changed its name to West Indian Gazette, and Afro-Asian Caribbean News. So we're going to quote from a book called Claudia Jones, Beyond Containment, edited by Carol Boyce Jones, published in 2011 by Ayebia Clark Publishing. It's in part seems to be funded by the British Colonial Arts Council of England, and it's on page 6, entitled Black Women Can Think and Speak and Write. It's a statement before being sentenced to a 1 year and a day imprisonment by Judge Edward J. Dimmock, may he burn in hell, excuse us, after a 9 months trial of 13 communist leaders at Foley Square, New York, 1953. So, to quote, "Your Honour, there are a few things I wish to say, for if what I say here serves even one whit to further dedicate growing millions of Americans to fight for peace and to repel the fascist drive on free speech and thought in our country, I shall consider my rising to speak worthwhile indeed. Quite candidly, Your Honour, I say these things not with an idea that what I say will influence your sentence of me, for even with all the power Your Honour holds, how can you decide to mete out justice for the only act to which I proudly plead guilty, and one, moreover, which by your own prior rulings constitutes no crime, that upholding communist ideas, of being a member and officer of the Communist Party of the United States? Will you measure, for example, as worthy of 1 year sentence my passionate adherence to the idea of fighting for full, unequivocal equality for my people, the Negro people, which as a communist I believe can only be achieved allied to the cause of the working class? A year for another vital communist belief that the bestial Korean War is an unjust war? Or my belief that peaceful coexistence of nations can be achieved and peace won if struggled for? Another year for my belief that only under socialism will exploitation of man by man be finally abolished and the great human and industrial resources of the nation be harnessed for the well-being of the people? Still another year sentence for my belief that the denial of exercise for free speech and thought to communists only proceeds, as history confirms, the denial of the exercise of these rights to all Americans, etc. Honourable Judge, of course Your Honour might choose still another path for sentence. You will no doubt choose as the basis for sentence the concocted lies which flowed so smoothly from the well-paid tongues of stool pigeons and informers who paraded before you here and gave so-called evidence which the court has asserted was amply justified. Amply justified, Your Honour? What has been amply justified? The lives of degenerate witnesses like Young Love, who can only be compared to Van der Lubbe of the famous Reichstag trial, the despicable forced admission of the Negro witness Cummings, who laughed at the thought of his $10,000 Judas gold jingling in his pocket when he said he would turn informer on his own mother for a mess of the prosecutor's pottage, the ill practice and unspeakable droning of the other Negro informer Rossa, who blurted out his well-memorized script, and even on Your Honour's prodding would drift off into half-intelligible intonations. I don't know what you're talking about. To name but a few examples, amply justified indeed this evidence. There was no official stamp powerful enough, Your Honour, to dignify the obscenity of this trial of ideas. Hence, for me to accept the verdict of guilty would only mean that I considered myself less worthy of the dignity of truth, which I cherish as a communist and as a human being, and also unsuitable to the utter contempt with which I hold such sordid performances. That is why I find now, as throughout this trial of the ideas of Marxism-Leninism, that it is we, the defendants, who are morally free, and conversely it is the prosecutors and the court itself that stands naked before the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and the people of our country. It is this, Your Honour, that explains the not-so-strange reason that you yourself observe that we feel no guilt. For true though it is that the prosecutor has its framed-up verdict on a framed-up indictment and trial, it is not we communist defendants who tremble at this final stage of these trial court proceedings, but the very prosecutors of our ideas. Truly, the prosecution's victory sits shakily, for our ideas were confirmed in the course of this trial itself. It was the world-renowned Karl Marx, founder of the Marx-Leninist science, for which application to American and world historical conditions was so fearfully convicted, who long ago predicted that the time would come when the powers that be would no longer live by the very laws they themselves have fashioned. In the libraries and great institutions of learning, and yes, Your Honour, particularly in the homes of Negroes and white workers, will not such reading, which will not stop this or any other Smith Act trial, will not men and women and youth think and ponder that such a time is here. The thinking process, as Your Honour well knows, is a process that defies jailing. When it is all boiled down, what shows is not the strength of the policies and practices of our prosecutors, which are akin to police-state practices, but the desperate fear of the people. Nothing shows this more, Your Honour, than our exposure of the biased jury drawn from a system which virtually excludes Negroes, Puerto Ricans and manual workers. This virtual exclusion exists not because of the lack of qualifications or even financial hardship, but because of the deliberate discrimination based on consciously cultivated white supremacist ruling class prejudice which sullies our boasted Western culture. This conscious white supremacist prejudice, which Mr. Perry so well pointed out, was shown in the gingerly handling by the prosecutors and oft-times the court of the Achilles heel of this alleged force and violence charge against us in relation to the Negro question. Introduce a title page to show Claudia Jones wrote an article during the indictment period, but you dare not read even a line of it, even to a biased jury on which sat a lone Negro juror, there by mere accident, since he was an alternate well through most of the trial. You dare not, gentlemen of the prosecution, assert that Negro women can think and speak and write. Moreover, you dare not read it because the article not only refutes the assertion that the ruling class will ever grant equality to 15 million Negro Americans, but shows that we are granted is unrequited force and violence not only in the unpunished barbaric crime of lynching, but in eating, in everyday existence, in living, in the armed forces, in jails, in the denial of land and recreation, yes, even in the nation's cemeteries. The prosecution also cancelled out the overt act which accompanied the original indictment of the defendant, Jones, entitled Women in the Struggle for Peace and Security. And why, Your Honour? It cannot be read, Your Honour. It urges American mothers, Negro women and white to emulate the peace struggles of their anti-fascist sisters in Latin America and the new European democracies in the Soviet Union, in Asia and Africa, to end the bestial Korean War, to stop Operation Killer, to bring our boys home, to reject the militarist threat to embroil us in a war with China, so that their children should not suffer the fate of the Korean babies murdered by napalm bombs of B-29s or the fate of Hiroshima. Is all this not further proof that we were also tried for was our opposition to racist ideas so integral a part of the desperate drive by the men of Wall Street to war and fascism? One thought pervaded me throughout this trial and pervades me still, and it is this. In the 9.5 months of this trial, millions of children have been born. I speak only of those who live. Will the future of those children, including those of our defendants, even Your Honour's grandchildren, be made more secure by the jailing of 13 men and women communists whose crimes are not criminal acts but advocacy of ideas? Is this not a tyrannical violation of the American dream of life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness? It was an American junior high school where I first learned of the great traditions of popular liberty of American history, for which I then received the Theodore Roosevelt Award for Good Citizenship. that I have learned to interpret that history and to work to influence its change for the betterment of the people with the indispensable weapon of Marxist-Leninist ideas, that is the real crime against me. Of all other charges, I am innocent. It was here on this soil, and not as Mr. Lane would depict to this court as a young child of 8 years of age waving revolutionary slogans, that I had early experiences which are shared by millions of native-born Negroes. The bitter indignity and humiliation of second-class citizenship, the special status which makes a mockery of our government's prated claims of a free America in a free world for 15 million Negro Americans. It was out of my Jim Crow experiences as a young Negro woman, experiences likewise born of working class poverty, that led me in my search of why these things had to be, that led me to join the Young Communist League and to join at the age of 18 the philosophy of my life, the science of Marxism-Leninism, that philosophy that only rejects racist ideas but is the antithesis of them. In this courtroom, there has often flashed before me dozens of meetings of Negro and white workers in the great auto plants of the Rouge, of New England, textile workers, of students, and of women active in the peace struggle which I have addressed on behalf of my party, just as now there flashes in my mind's eye those young Negro women I have seen at the Women's House of Detention, almost children, of whom, but for my early discovery of Marxist-Leninism, I might have had to say now, there might I have been. For what crimes? Petty crimes born of poverty, of the ghetto, of Jim Crow living, the crime of being born black on American soil, of resisting treatment, rebellion against which, unchanneled, becomes lawless against the very Jim Crow society that perpetrates their lawlessness. One need only be a Negro in America to know that for the crime of being a Negro, we are daily convicted by a government which denies us elementary democratic rights, the right to vote, to hold office, to hold judgeships, to serve on juries, rights forcibly denied in the South and also in the North. And I want to concur with Mr. Perry's proposal to Mr. Lane that he recommend to the Department of Justice they show more zeal, since they have not ever prosecuted a single anti-Semite or a Ku Kluxer in the United States, with its total of 5,000 lynched Negro men, women and children since the 1860s. I am aware that these things are not to the liking of the prosecution or even of this court, but that cannot be helped. For one of the historical truths of all history is that the oppressed never revere their oppressors. Now I come to close. The probation official who interrogated me was a Negro official. Your Honor undoubtedly has his reports before you. One of the questions that he asked me was, did I ever believe in any religion? I told him then that this was a personal, private matter and was guaranteed under the First Amendment of the Constitution. I wonder now, Your Honor, if somehow falsely reckoned, as many officials falsely reckon, that a change of belief or conviction in one's mature life is like putting on a new dress or a new hat. I could have quoted scripture to him, the scripture applied by leading Negro religious figure in tribute and observation of the Smith Act jailing one of the outstanding sons of the Negro people, Ben Davis, now incarcerated in the Jim Crow Federal Penitentiary of Terre Indiana. The scripture runs, "Smite down the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered." And this, Honourable Judge, is exactly what is the purpose of all Smith Act trials. This one in particular, I share the faith of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Petty Perry and all my co-defendants that America's working people, Negro and white, will surely rise, not like sheep, but with vigilance towards their liberty, to assure that peace will win and the decadent Smith Act, which contravenes the Bill of Rights, will be swept from the scene of history. It was the great Frederick Douglass who had a price on his head, who said, "Without struggle there is no progress." And echoing his words was the answer of the great abolitionist James Russell Lowell. The limits of tyranny is prescribed by the measure of our resistance to it. If out of this struggle history assesses that I and my co-defendants have made some small contribution, I shall consider my role small indeed. The glorious exploits of anti-fascist heroes and heroines, honoured today in all lands for their contribution to social progress, will, just like the role of our prosecutors, also be measured by the people of the United States in that coming day. I have concluded, Your Honour. End of quote. Wow! Oh, just incredible prose and poetry, just incredible passion, intellect, revolutionary fire. I mean, you can see it's the predecessor to people like Kathleen Cleaver being up in the courts, to people like Afeni Shakur. I mean, it's like, one can see how the baton was passed on to the likes of Robert F. Williams, and ongoingly intergenerationally the leadership of W.E. Du Bois and Shirley Graham Du Bois and Malcolm X, and then the many others, the sons and daughters of Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party. You can see this kind of this unbroken intergenerational silsila, as they would say in Hindustani or Urdu, this unbroken chain of revolutionary fire. Just incredible, really amazing. So you can see the continuous parallels, and generation after generation of black resistance, ever since colonialism touched upon Africa and its in its attempts of looting and enslavement of people. The resistance, also often led by black women, and then the repression, then the false accusations, and then the repressions breeding further resistance, kind of distilling and synthesizing and making sharper. I mean, one's also reminded of Paul Robeson's retorts when he was up at the House of Un-American Activities. Just incredible eloquence. And her reference to the Korean War, the genocidal war conducted by British and USA neocolonialism, killing 4 million Koreans in 3 years, leading to the partition of Korea, which continues today. This great contribution to humanity of genocidal partitions, especially by the British in Ireland, in India, across Africa, in Palestine, Sykes-Picot in Syria, in Korea, so on and so forth. Just amazing fire, amazing, inspiring. Can't wait to bring you more. That's Counter-Narrative News. Great, profound, deep, heartfelt, comradely, loving, revolutionary salutations to Claudia Jones the Great.